My name is Alex James and it's a pleasure to be online with you today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Small Farms Network Capital Region is a grassroots information service. The volunteer committee help organise events and programs specifically designed for small farmers. This event would not be possible without their hard work, and I thank them for their support. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the National Landcare Program, through the Australian Government. So I'm just going to spend a few moments explaining how you can participate in this webinar. You can type your questions into the chat box. If you select everyone, when you send your message, other people can see what you have asked. The chat box messages will be recorded. This webinar will be recorded and placed on the Small Farms Network Capital Region YouTube channel, and attendees cannot be seen in the recording. At the end of this webinar, I invite you to complete a survey that comes up when the Zoom session is finished. Your feedback helps us plan and deliver events like this one. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Vince Heffernan is a sixth generation farmer and owner of Moorelands Biodynamic Lamb. He's on the committee of the Upper Lachlan Landcare Group and is passionate about regenerative agriculture and the environment. Vince practices holistic management principles on his farm to improve biodiversity and productivity and has planted thousands of trees through his efforts with Landcare. He studied ecological agriculture at the University of Sydney and is completing a master's in regenerative agriculture at the University of Canberra. So Vince, I'm just going to stop my share there and say hello. Welcome this evening. Thanks for joining us.
That's all right.
So I'll just invite you to start your screen share if you'd like to. Or...
Sure. Fingers crossed, everybody. So, bingo.
There we go. That's looking really good. Thanks, Vince.
I feel very relieved that that's worked too. Don't worry.
Yeah, and we've got 37 people online with us too. So Everyone's arrived. That's good.
All right, that's great. So away we go. We've had a lot of welcome, everybody, and I'd certainly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on. This is the Pajong country where I am, which is part of the larger Ngunnawal nation, and we're right on the border of where the Ngunnawal nation meets the Wiradjuri one. So interesting place in the landscape. We've had a lot of rain in the last little bit, and I've got on the western border of my farm is the Lachlan River, and this is a picture of the Lachlan as you'd see it. It's really on the upper Lachlan, and it's not much more than a stream. You can sort of see it just over the top of my pumpkins there. And also on the right, it's not much of a tributary there. But when we had rain like we had in the last week, well, we get a flood, and the flood photo taken from roughly the same spot. You can see there's a lot more water. This was in 2010, and I felt pretty sorry for myself in 2010 because there's an enormous amount of fences knocked out. A lot of sort of infrastructure in that sense. But of course, the infrastructure in places like Queensland was much more dramatic. People lost houses and very sadly, people lost their lives. And so that put things in perspective. But as you'd sit and you'd watch the river there, you'd often see just, you might see a bale of hay float by, a big round bale, or even a dead cow or something like that. And that seemed pretty dramatic. And certainly, the cleanup that happened afterwards was really what worried me most about the flood. But I saw this headline in the paper of 30,000 pigs lost in a flooded river up in Queensland, and I just couldn't get my head around what that much must look like. Having seen, a cow, they always go past with all four legs in the air, sort of saluting as they do when they're dead in a river. But to see 30,000 pigs, I thought, well, that would be just bizarre. And this was up at Rockhampton, and you can see it in the bottom left-hand corner of the front page of the newspaper there, 30,000 pigs. I'll just blow that up if you like. 30,000 pigs swept away in flood. And as it so turns out, that the journalist who'd rung up and spoke to the farmer slightly misunderstood what was said to them. And it wasn't 30,000 pigs, but 30 sows and pigs lost in the flooded river. And I thought in that vein, I'm just keen that you understand what I'm trying to say tonight and don't misunderstand. And if you've got questions at any time or during the course of the evening, feel free to share them. I don't believe I think that regenerative agriculture is a very complex sort of complex thing because we're dealing with nature. Human systems are often complicated, but natural systems are complex. And so by their nature, there's some things that we probably try and shy away from. But through the course of the evening, this is what we're going to try and cover. So I'd like to just share my story because I don't feel like I'm an expert on regenerative agriculture, and it's certainly not where I set out to go. But I think if you understand how I got here, it'll make a little bit more sense to you. I'd like to let you have a look at my farm and sort of see some of the things that make up the landscape where I am. So Moorelands, just so as everyone understands, is north of Canberra, north of Gunning. So if you drew a straight line between towns like Yass and Crookwell, where we'd be exactly halfway between those two towns. If you drew a straight line between Burra and Goulburn, we're directly between those two towns. So sort of out in the middle of nowhere a little bit, but in the same general sort of sphere as the type of climate and the challenges that you see in and around Canberra. So once you get a feel for what Moorelands is like, I want you to understand why it's perceived as different. And Alex mentioned there that we're biodynamic, we're holistic grazers, so we have a different attitude to grazing to a lot of sheep cockies, and we've got a long history of planting native vegetation here and trying to do things there. So after all that, then we're actually going to try and talk about regenerative agriculture, and then I suppose, and with that in mind, then we can look at what we do with small holdings or what some of the opportunities are. And again, it's important you understand that I don't have all the answers, but I have some experience of doing these things, so I might be able to share some thoughts with you. And I'll be really interested to hear your feedback at that point in time, because I think that those challenges are often individual, and so they're going to raise your own specific questions out of that. Okay, so my story really started with a butcher's shop, and maybe before that I should add that this is a farm that's been in the family for about 180 odd years, 6 generations, as Alex mentioned. And so when I was at high school, all I wanted to do was come home and work on a farm. So having completed my HSC, I was immediately straight back to the farm. I'm 58 years old, so this was 1982 when I finished school, and it was a good time to be back on the farm, because 82, 83 was a really dramatic drought, and the worst that people had seen. So it was the worst in living memory, at least at that point in time. Probably been eclipsed a little bit by some of the happenings in the last 2 decades, but it really was, it was interesting to be able to live through that. I left the farm. I didn't work well with my father, and so I left the farm and went over to Canberra for about 17 odd years. And while I was over there, I had an interest, I guess, more in wine. I was really interested in wine, but I had friends who were had an interest in wine, but also in food. And some of these people, Paul Kitsons and Albert Catons, really were people who taught me how to cook and really shaped my view of food. But there were others as well. And the chap who took this photograph, his name's Alan Benson. And Alan and another friend of his, Matthew, were chefs, and they were trying to get out of being chefs. And so Alan wanted to be a photographer. And so this is actually a photograph of my meat that I had done recently for my website. But Alan wanted to become a photographer, and Matthew was trying to do writing. Now, Matthew's gone on to become a bigger entity again. You know, he's the gourmet farmer down in Tasmania. But these guys had told me about, you know, as you're cooking, I came to appreciate that organic and particularly biodynamic produce perform differently in the kitchen. That by that you could. It wasn't just taste; it was how these ingredients might the aroma that they had, the keeping quality that they had, and how they perform in recipes as well. So I was really attracted to the concepts of organic and biodynamic. And they told me about a butcher's shop in the inner south where there was a queue. So this is, you know, back in the early 90s, I guess, a queue of shoppers out the front door on Saturday mornings. And I'd never heard of this concept before. And sure enough, it was a butcher selling the produce of a man by the name of Ron Ward from Cootamundra, who was a Demeter certified biodynamic farmer. And that was really, I guess, the starting point for my interest in biodynamics, at least. And after that, I decided that I should try and find out everything I could. And I did a 6-day course on biodynamics. It was sort of 3 weekends. And that filled in some of the gaps for me, but I still felt very uneasy about biodynamics. It seemed like fairies at the bottom of the garden type stuff, really freaked out hippie shit, as one person recently described what I do. And I could well equate with that, you know, this burying of horns filled with manure at the equinox and digging it up at the next equinox, you know, like, what the dickens is this all about? And so I did want to find out more, and I found a degree in ecological agriculture being run by University of Sydney out of their newly purchased Orange campus. They purchased the old Orange Ag College there. And so after 2 gap decades, I know gap years are quite popular now, but I had 2 gap decades, I returned to go to university. And that course, I think, really was important to me because it opened my eyes to a whole host of new ideas and concepts. There were units on organic agriculture, units on biodynamic, as I mentioned, units on permaculture, and there's a heap of stuff on ecology. So ecology, applied ecology, human ecology. And I particularly enjoyed following up and getting a better understanding of soil ecology, thanks to Elaine Ingham. And in parallel with that, twice a year you go out on field trips, and I ended up at some wonderful farms and met some wonderful people. So Bruce Maynard, so this is 2 decades ago, but Bruce Maynard, even this year, just won the Landcare Bob Hawke Award. And John Priestley at Patterson is a biodynamic farmer growing oranges. And Alan Druce was one of the first organic farmers in the state. So he was organic back in 1962. His property is called Green Grove, and his son runs the Junee licorice factory, where they make good licorice. If you ever get the opportunity, I'd encourage you to do that. And certainly, I don't want to put it all down to being able to access this this study. In parallel with that, there were other things happening in my life. So, members of Canberra Organic Garden group, and through them, I ended up out at All Sun Farm one day, met Joyce and Michael, who ran All Sun Farm, and what they were doing there was just mind blowing. My dad would always grow veggies here, and but what they were doing was just a totally different approach to farming in my experience. And they told me about people like Joel Salatin, and I became a big fan of Joel Salatin's. And this was before Joel was famous in any way, shape, or form. And I thought that I was really attracted to his idea of these pasture-raised chickens. And so Joyce and Michael told me about Claire and Sam, who are doing these pasture-raised chickens out at Wombat Whole Foods, I think they called themselves. And Claire and Sam are now box gum grazing at Moringa. So you may run across some of these people from time to time. And they in turn told me about Alan Savory and his holistic grazing. And coincidentally, two of the other people who did study at Orange at the University of Sydney course at that time were David Marsh of Burra, who's probably the best exponent of holistic grazing in the state, in my opinion. And he was doing a Master of Sustainable Agriculture, which is sort of the next step up from what I was doing. And also a young footballer called David Pocock, who was from Zimbabwe, which is also where Alan Savory was from. And I've been lucky enough to know David and Emma since. But these are all these sort of interconnecting threads. So I got involved in Landcare soon after I arrived back on the farm here, and there was there were the things like the Bill Zedike stuff that I was really impressed with. He was an American who talks about the flow of water through the landscape, and he was a pre-runner to some of the Peter Andrews type work, and I'm a big fan of Peter Andrews, his understanding of hydrology. And there were other people through Landcare, locally John and Mary Walsh. I'd seen what a difference planting trees had made on their property, and John and Jan Weatherston at Linfield Park are really the benchmark in our area. That's where Prince Charles, as he was, now King Charles, went and visited John and Jan Weatherston's property, Linfield Park, flew in by helicopter and saw it. And I think that's probably testament to how good a setup they'd made of that particular property there. And there were others. I mentioned Greening Australia simply because to this day it still influences the things that I do. Leon Gary was a farmer out at Bynalong, and Brian Cumberland was working at Greening Australia, and they devised a program called Whole of Paddock Rehabilitation, which I think is just brilliant. And Graham Fifield was a young student who did his honours study on that Whole of Paddock Rehabilitation, and now works at Greening Australia implementing that program. And I'm a big fan, and I'll certainly put a couple of paddocks down that way here. And of course, there was the influence of some of the important people in biodynamics in Australia. Alex Podolinsky, Trevor Hatch and Linton Greenwood are second and third generation biodynamic farmers, and are at the fore of that organisation subsequent to Alex passing away. I would raise with you Darren Aitken, if you do get a chance. Darren Aitken's got a lovely YouTube video. So if you put Darren's name in on the YouTube video and add other words like Vortex Veggies, which is his company, Vortex Veggies, or horse paddock, he transforms a really poor bit of soil into something fantastic through biodynamic. So all of these people were influencing me along the way and helping me to sort of come to a different understanding and a different. That's a picture of me and Joel Salatin. We happened to both be talking at a conference a couple of years back. That's me impersonating a much younger man. It was great to meet these people that I'd just read their books and talked to. And you might think, well, how do you gain this knowledge? Well, I think that we just have to disconnect from the screen. And I know we're all looking at a screen here tonight, but there's so much rubbish on television that we can go and gather information. We don't have to go and do formal study. We can pick up books, and of course nowadays we have things like these headsets that you can attach to an audio book and be listening as you go around and work. And I think that knowledge gathering for me through all of those different channels really changed and shaped how I was. It changed the way that I could understand the landscape. Certainly my paradigm had shifted because I saw things in a very different way. And part of that was seeing how damaged the landscape was and the ecosystem was, and the functionality of that system. And so obviously, you can't get that type of information and ignore it. So I sought to fix what I could to repair that. And here on Moorelands, one of the most important things was planting trees. And when I say trees, I'm talking about native vegetation. So that's everything from sedges and carrocks and native grasses through to gum trees and lots and lots of wattles and understory plants. Particular focus on the riparian zones. I guess you can see that these are the areas most damaged and also often most valued for agriculture, but not valued for their ecological values. And to see where the gaps were in the landscape. So there was this observing and trying to fix things through after observation. I think there was a very different respect for the soil, and part of the biodynamic process is putting out these preps. So they're going out at homeopathic type levels, but in essence, what you're doing is you're inoculating the soil with the microorganisms, and then if you graze properly, you allow that soil to repair and come back. And if you don't overstock and you don't bare the ground, then you also protect that soil. So there was a really different approach to the soil out of all of this. And I never thought that while there was a lot of work being done on Moorelands, I never thought that Moorelands was going to be some sort of an oasis. I always felt that there was a need to fix the whole landscape. And so for 20 years, I've been very heavily involved in Landcare and lots of other organisations trying to bring that about. I'd like to show you just some photos of the farm. This is Pippa on top of a quad bike. One of the things I've just sort of noticed is that there's a hoe on the quad bike. So on all the vehicles at home, there's hoes. And that's because the weeding's done by hand. So if you see a serrated tussock, then you take it out. And the farm sort of, as I mentioned, with the western side of it is on the Lachlan River. So we're at the bottom of a valley. So there's some parts of it that are steep. The gullies have been fenced off and the riparian zones have been fenced off and planted out. And you can see some gullies there that have been planted out in that shot. I'm a sheep farmer. I grow Texels, they're a type of meat sheep. I direct market my lamb through both the Epic markets in Canberra and the Carriagework markets in Sydney. I go to each once a month. And additionally, I have a butcher down in Sydney, Feather and Bone, who take as much of my lamb as I can afford to give them. So yeah, look, the landscape out on the back creek. This is the back creek, and you can see there's been a lot of poplars planted out there, but you can see there's massive old gum trees in amongst things there too, and little bits of while there's dotted trees, all those trees are all very old, and it's a bit like looking at a paddock full of geriatrics. You know, they're old trees, and there's not the young trees there that should be there, because for the last 150 or 200 years, those sheep that you see in the foreground have been hoovering up the seedlings as fast as they come up. And that's one of the things that we desperately have to fix is getting that, is bringing that functionality of that ecosystem back. I'll talk a little bit later about holistic grazing, but it does involve having big mobs of animals for effect. So the typical Texel, great big wingnut ears, sort of dark tear ducts, dark around the nose and the hoofs, and a real sort of barrel of a body. There's a lot of things in my landscape that weren't great. There's certainly trees that have died, like this one, and there's others that were ring-barked, and others that were cut down and used for timber, for sheds and for fencing and the like. So I now just want to talk about some of the things that we do differently on the farm. So holistic grazing is one, and I believe that this is something you've spoken about, and it's really important in holistic grazing that one part of the enterprise isn't sacrificed for another. So in other words, we don't give up the environment just because we're chasing profitability. We have to serve all masters. And by its nature, I like to think that there's sort of four aspects to holistic grazing. The first one is high density. So lots of mouths per acre or per hectare. They're there for a short duration. On my farm, that's typically a day or a couple of days. And then there's a long rest period. And that long rest period might be up to, say, 5 months, but it allows the land to recuperate, allows the soil to recuperate. And really importantly, it's a matter of matching the stocking rate to the carrying capacity. As I was reading, leading up to this, I saw Charlie Massey talked about stocking rates, and he used the word the deemed stocking rate. And it was certainly something that I encountered growing up, was that if people said that the stocking rate for a property was, 1,000 wethers or whatever, it was considered that that's what you could run all the time. Whereas now the carrying capacity is seen as something that's fluctuates with the season. So right now we've got a lot of growth, and our carrying capacity is much higher than average. And by rights, I should be increasing my stocking rate to match that carrying capacity. During a drought back in 2018, dramatically destocked the farm because the carrying capacity was reduced. And so that's what it means to match your stocking rate to your carrying capacity, looking at the season, the ability for the soil to grow grass, and reducing or increasing stock numbers accordingly. Biodynamics is the work of a polymath by the name of Rudolf Steiner, who late in his career talked about agriculture, and he particularly was railing against what was the increase post World War I of water-soluble so-called fertilizers that were putting elements like potassium or nitrogen or phosphorus in the water for plants to take up. And he felt, and he was certain that this was not healthy because the plants had no control. They had to take water in as they respired. And he came up with a number of solutions for the problems that were starting to occur as a result. On Moorelands, I'm a Demeter certified farmer. I don't think it's relatively easy to get Demeter certification, but it's not you're essentially organic, and then you're doing a whole host of other things to try and, including putting the preps out, which is what I'm doing here in this photo. One of the key people is Alex Podolinsky there on the right, who his family's originally from the Ukraine, and he sort of fled Nazi Germany and ended up in Australia as a refugee. I think he's actually had a title of Count Podolinsky. So he's an interesting guy, or was an interesting guy. He's dead, of course, now, but he was great at adapting biodynamics to the broadacre farms in Australia. One of the things that happened with biodynamics is that you stir the preps into water, and that was often done by hand, but because of scale, we utilise machines here to do it. And these are my stirring machines. We're creating a vortex, then it reverses and it goes the other direction. One of the other things on moorlands that's done differently is the planting of trees. And this was often done in conjunction with people like the Catchment Management Authority. Catchment Management Authority has been bound in with some other groups to become the LLS, the Local Land Services now. And at various points in time, there was funding for projects like the one that's in this photo here, where an erosion was being fixed by building a dam. So just keep an eye on the tree. I'll just show you some sort of subsequent. So you can see the dam that was built there, trees still there, and there were some 700 or 800 trees planted on about 2 hectares of ground there. And another shot of the same area today. On moorlands, there's been over probably about 20% of the farm that's been treated in this way, where it's been excluded from stock for a period of time while vegetation's been established on it. A lot of them are riparian zones. This is a very ordinary photo of a tank, I know, but just look at the gully beyond the tank and then look at it again, and you can see that gully was fenced off and trees were planted. And you can see those trees in a fairly recent photo are well established down that gully. Often planting was done with funding from people like EnviroFund or Greening Australia, and they would pay for a second fence to be built next to an existing fence. So you can see the new fence sort of out to the right there. I hope you can see it. And there'd be 5 rows of trees planted in that space in between. So just keep your eye on this strainer post with the stay coming out to the left, and you'll see that same strainer post with the stay coming out to the left there with the trees up and away. So sort of the before and after type photos is what I'm trying to demonstrate here. Those narrow plantings were good, but they weren't ideal for the maximum amount of biodiversity. A lot of the small woodland birds are only a few grams in size, and they really prefer to have 50 or 100 meters of depth of a planting as opposed to 15 or 25 meters along a fence line. And so this is one of those larger, broader block plantings, as we call them on moorlands. And again, a sort of a photo afterwards, and another one where it's sort of in the landscape. And these are very, very effective, and I think incredibly good if you can manage to do them. Often when you just lock things up, other things appear, and this is a plant that appeared when some land was locked up at home, and it's Underoo, or wild tomato, and it's got narcotic properties. It's got some sort of before you ask, I don't know how you prepare it to make sure you don't kill yourself. So maybe don't try this at home, kiddies. But it's got some sort of narcotic properties, supposedly. And interestingly, it's not a plant that's from our region. That's from much further west. But it's at a tree that was, Indigenous people have told me, was a birthing tree on moorlands. And it's a ring tree. And that ring tree is part of a series of other ring trees that are warning trees. I can't show you a photo of the ring tree, the birthing tree. Perhaps sometime if you're out my way, you can drop in and we'll go for a drive out there. But I would like to, I can show you one of the warning trees. It's also got that ring in it. You can see the trunks have been grafted back together again, and they're up high in the tree, and that's about 1 kilometre from the birthing tree. So this would be to signal that you're going to a place where you shouldn't go. The birthing tree was a woman's site, a sacred site, and that you should stop if you didn't know where you were in the landscape. Done a number of things with various Indigenous people. One of the most interesting things I was allowed to do was travel with some Wiradjuri people up to Cape York, and I met these two guys up there. This is Robert Redford and his son, Robert Redford Jr., and they're actually from Arnhem Land, but they were explaining about bush tucker to me and to others. And that workshop was run by a guy called Victor Stephenson. So that's Victor there, and there's a book Victor's got called Fire Country that I'd encourage you to go and buy and read. And Victor's just been doing a bit of burning there, and the Dalrymple boys in the background, and you can see everyone's barefoot and burning. And he's got his RFS fire pants on, admittedly, but it did blow me away a bit, the Indigenous attitude to burning up there. And these people have got a long connection. Old Tommy George was the patriarch. He's passed away. You know, it was incredible to run into, be able to meet these people and see that Indigenous burning in the landscape and how it shaped the landscape. Importantly, it didn't allow the landscape to run to forest. And a lot of the time in my area, there's patches of forest, or often it's called scrub by farmers, but those are not old patches. They're only patches of forest that have occurred because Indigenous people were taken out of the system with their cool burning. So just going back to Moorelands, one of the things that has been done is to try to link these block plantings, and that's been done by using these tree guards. So a tree guard used to be about $35 for the mesh and about $15, $5 each for a steel post. Of course, steel's gone through the roof, so you can probably add another $10 or $20 to that. But those individual trees give you, allow stepping stones across the landscape. Work out of Orange showed that those small birds will only travel a maximum of 60 metres from one tree to another. They don't like to be out in the open for fear of predation. So it's really important to try and help those birds move from one site to another by building little stepping stones through your property or through your paddocks. Those individual trees, given a little bit more time, and when I say a little bit more time, that one's about 5 years old, but when they're about 130 or 140 years old, they can be also habitat for superb parrots who need the hollows to nest. This photo here was taken by me of a wattle planted on moorlands, Acacia rubida, and the superb parrots just love those sort of not quite ripe seeds. You can see they're quite green, the seed pods there on these. This is the southern pygmy perch, and it's an endangered fish in our area. There's a lot of work being done by Gunning District Landcare on both the Blakeney Creek site and also the Oolong Creek site where this has been found. And there are only 2 of 4 sites in New South Wales where it now exists. And I mention this simply because it's a different facet, and I want to show you this in the next photo. So just look at Luke. Luke's standing down in the creek. This is Blakeney Creek, and you can see even from here just the amount of foliage around that creek. So this is Phragmites on the edge of the creek. Further up, there's some Kumbungi, but he's standing in some milfoil there. And if you look beyond him, you can see that milfoil, and there's a really dense amount of underwater plants growing in that creek there. And that's been key to the habitat for those little fish, and also for a frog called the yellow-spotted bellfrog to survive. And they're the things that you can do on your farm. So if you have a creek, you can bring those plants back in those creeks. And if you've got dams, you can plant in those dams and get those things happening. And that's certainly stuff that's been attempted at Moorelands with varying degrees of success. Some are fantastic, others are struggling a little bit. But Luke's famous for a whole host of other things, but I'll save running a show on Luke just right now. Whenever I talk to farmers about planting natives, particularly understory stuff, I find it's a lot easier to convince them to plant some things rather than others. So this little green evergreen shrub here in front is called Bassaria, and it flowers on the longest day of the year. So comes out at Christmas time, and the seed pods emerge about Easter, about late summer, early autumn. And the seed pods are very high in protein. They're about 30% protein, and sheep love them. They'll hoover them up. They'll aid them through what is often a very tough season. The shrubs themselves are good fire retardants. They catch sparks and the like. And really importantly, when this plant is the host plant for Hymenoptera, or wasps, and there's a big wasp there you can see just enjoying the flowers on Christmas Day. And those wasps are the biggest insect control agent in the ecosystem, more important than birds, more important than bats. So if you lose Bassaria out of your system, then quite possibly you'll lose your wasps. And if you lose your wasps, all of a sudden you might have too many flies or grasshoppers or mosquitoes or something else. So we have to get some balance back in the system. And it's very easy to convince someone to go and plant this if they understand those sort of concepts. But less easy to convince us to plant something like Alocasuarina, because it's a tree, but it's a tree that's sometimes a little bit harder to grow, and doesn't provide food or shade, maybe as well as some other trees. But the Alocasuarina looks a little bit like casuarinas, like Casuarina cunninghamania and the like. These are often called bull oaks, whereas your casuarinas are called she oaks. But these are absolutely critical for a bird that's about a parrot-sized cockatoo, so a very small cockatoo called the glossy blacks. So not to be confused with the yellow-tailed blacks, those magnificent large cockatoos that you see around Canberra and particularly around the conifer forests. That the glossy black is totally dependent upon this Alocasuarina. And so if we're really interested in getting our ecosystem working, we need to plant everything. It has to include Alocasuarinas as well. I think often drought is when systems that are working show out more so than in the good times, because it's often a little bit hard to define. I don't want to say that this photo was taken on my farm, because that might upset a neighbour or two of mine. So let's just say it's a farm. But it's important to see just how bare that ground is there on the left. And that's one thing that we should be all trying to avoid, is bare ground. You can see sheep still out in the same paddock as it, so there's no doubt it's not going to recover quickly when it comes back. Both of these properties are running about the same number of sheep, but it's just being done in a different way. So it's differently grazed management. So it's all about the farmer, the person, not the animals. And this was taken about 18 months after it had broken the drought. And at that stage, the property on the left had totally destocked that paddock, hadn't had any stock in it. But you can see it's still got that bare ground and it's still struggling to come back. When you have set stock properties, you end up with a lot of compaction, and that becomes really obvious when you get rain because it sheets across. When this rain event occurred, I had dams that had no water in them. So there was no water ran across the farm at home, which is pretty distressing when you need a little bit of water in dams. But the good news is that water was going into the soil rather than straight across the top of the soil and probably taking soil and manure and nutrients with it as it went. And if you take a lot of soil across the top of the paddock, then it eventually ends up in creeks like the one I showed you there before with Luke Pierce in it, and it fills those holes full of dirt. So you suddenly end up with a creek rather than having big, deep holes, that a creek that's all, only a couple of centimetres deep the whole way down. And you start to lose species like this beautiful yellow-spotted bell frog. So it was a photo that was taken for me by Luke in that hole on that particular day that we were there. And these are great big frogs. They're the size of the palm of your hand. And sadly, I fear that they're probably extinct now, which is pretty shocking to think that that's happened in the last decade. A lot of downside of poor choices, and I'm not going to dwell on that, but we can make good choices, and there's a lot of upside in making good choices. So I did want to just address, these are the questions that I was asked to address tonight. So what is regenerative agriculture? So we're going to come to that, talking a little bit more about regenerative agriculture. And biodynamic farming, the certification process difficult? Well, it's difficult. There's some paperwork. It's it's $1,000 a year or something. So on small farms, it's possibly not appropriate to get certified. But on small farms, if you're selling your produce direct to consumers, they're going to know who you are, and they're going to be your certifying body. They're going to be the people who determine that you are or you aren't doing what you say you're doing. Certification is really for those consumers that are remote from you, who can't see what you're doing, so as they've got some peace of mind that it's being done properly. We're going to talk about small farmers in particular and how regenerative ag applies to them. And we're also going to talk about how we could possibly measure that. How do we know that we're having an effect, or we're being successful in any way, shape or form? So I just want to highlight with you that regenerative ag is certainly something that's growing in terms of interest. You can see by the number of articles where it's mentioned that this has become a much more dominant thing, and that's really grown in almost in exponential terms over recent years. So the problem really for regenerative ag is that there isn't a hard, fast, fully agreed definition of it. And why I say that this is a problem is that it opens the door for greenwashing, for people who want to just simply adopt the term and say, I'm regenerative agriculture adherent, and possibly expect a premium in the marketplace or the like. We recently saw Harris Farm have a big promotion of support your regenerative agriculture adherence, and they had a process, an internal process that nominated who those people were. I would question the validity of that process, I think that they fell well short of what they should have, but without a hard, fast, commonly agreed definition, it's one of the issues that we're going to have with regenerative agriculture. Here are a couple of definitions from various people, a couple of academics at the top, but I draw your attention to David Marsh's one down the bottom. He said, Regen Ag is about managing to allow measurable improvements over time. Measurable, very key word there, in ecosystem function, biological diversity, driven mostly by the self-organizing ecosystem towards a social, ecological, and financial goal. So I think it's really important David doesn't see the ecological separate to the financial. He sees that these are both married, and that he also understands that we've really got to be chasing biological diversity and ecosystem function in what we do. Some of the things that are raised when people try to talk about defining agriculture is that they say, well, we can talk about people who have a certain approach to agriculture, be that holistic grazing or biodynamics or whatever it might be, that approach is a regenerative ag approach, and therefore all is okay. I think that's got a lot of holes in it because, again, if you look at David Marsh's definition, he talks about ecosystem function and biological diversity. And in some cases, some of the people doing those things will do those as a matter of course, but others may not. Other people talk about the outcomes that you get from being a regen ag person. So they talk about things like whether you've got really good soil carbon. Now, good soil carbon may be something that you're blessed with, that you inherited, or when you bought your property, it had good soil carbon to start with. Alternatively, it may be something that that is the exact opposite. You bought a property with very poor soil carbon, but then your growth is going to be dramatic, whereas someone who's got good soil carbon already is not going to see that growth. So we've just got to be careful about using an outcomes approach to defining regen ag. And then people talk about the perception, the position that you bring to regen ag. So, for example, that permaculture is more human-centric, that's really about the earth providing services for humans, whereas with regenerative agriculture, there's a real focus on the ecosystem having a value in and of itself, and that should be ecocentric. Holistic management I was talking about there. Buzzwords like sustainability and ecological agriculture are terms that have gone out of favour a little bit. Sustainability talks about being able to manage something at the status quo. But really, if you accept that that things are broken, then you don't want to keep them broken. You want to improve them and repair them. So sustainability is not really what we're focused on with Regen Ag, I don't think. Ecological agriculture looks at the ecosystem sort of in and of itself. And so it doesn't bring into this equation the farmer or the produce or the financials or the social aspects. Often it's possible to define things by the negative. So you talk about what things aren't. And so I guess Regen Ag is not large industrial agriculture that you might think of with intensive piggeries or chook farms or anything that's relied on. The list here goes synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, inputs, but any input, unpaid or poorly paid labor, which is really an important part in many third world countries, declining soil function, soil health, or soil carbon. I think that we've seen in a lot of our grazing properties over the last 20 years, soil carbon levels decrease rather than increase. And I think that that's very hard for those people to stand there and then say that they've got systems that are regenerative ag in their style because of that declining soil carbon. Any system that destroys natural biodiversity or systems, any over-extraction of water without regard for others' needs, including environmental needs. So the moment you see things like blue-green algae, you know that there's been too much runoff from fertilizers. The moment you see erosion and low animal welfare outcomes, you know that you're not dealing with something that's a regenerative ag system. It has to remain profitable, otherwise it's not something that's usable. And I've been recently reading a book by Charles Monbiot called Regenerative, and he talks about the need for productivity. He said productivity, in his opinion, is all important. It's no good having a system that doesn't produce enough food for all of us. And I think that's something that we really need to get our heads around. Possibly we need to have different expectations of what we're going to eat, if that's going to be the case, because I think that you can't serve some of those masters quite at the same time. But they're some of the issues that we have to look at. And of course, are we producing nutrient-dense food is the other thing. So sure enough, over in the US, there is an organisation offering regenerative certification. They are certainly tying it to organics over there, so they're saying it should be chemical free. And a lot of people I come across believe that you can't be truly a regenerative agriculture adherent if you're a wide user of chemicals. And but I might just quickly pop through some of those, particularly the ones over on the right there. So building soil organic manner. So that's all about building soil carbon. Utilising things like conservation tillage. Cover crops is a really big component of any good biodynamic, organic, regenerative ag type approach. Crop rotation, so you shouldn't be just planting wheat year after year after year after year. And we've seen that that's led to huge problems here in Australia with a thing called striped rust now appearing in our cereals, and this fungi is devastating, and it's in turn it's seen a high usage of a fungicide to kill it that also kills so many beneficial fungi as well. So no GMOs, no soilless systems, so hydroponics, no synthetic inputs. So that's going to cut out pretty much all of your so-called fertilizers. It has to promote biodiversity and has to have rotational grazing. It talks about animal welfare, and too often we don't have animal welfare at the top of our list with any certification. And it talks about social fairness, so that's sort of across the board. And bear in mind, this is in the US. One of the books that I've been really impressed with recently is this book called Regeneration by Paul Hawken. And he maintained that regenerative ag was first mentioned by Robert Rodale back in 1980. And he's got his 6 points for something that's regenerative ag is recarbonize the soil. So get that carbon into the soil, limit the disturbance of the soil so you're not constantly ploughing it or tearing it apart. Keep the cover on the soil. So this is what I was talking about with the drought. You can't have bare ground. Hydrate the soil. So allow water to get in, and that's all about building structure in the soil. Put creatures on the soil. So he's a big believer in animals on the soil, and recognize that soil health is plant health is human health. And so it's a shifting of paradigms. I mentioned Regenerative, and I'd certainly encourage you to read this book. It's challenging. I don't agree with everything that's said. And one of the benefits of gathering information and reading from lots of different people is that you can form your own world view, and you can also question how people arrive at theirs. And I would think that George is sort of falls short of fully understanding how grazing works in around the world. He is a UK journalist, works for the Guardian, and I think that a lot of what he talks about is relevant to the UK, but he's talking about a global approach where we should move away from grazing animals, hence the cover where you see a whited out cow. And that's as a sheep farmer, that's pretty challenging stuff to read, but I also think that he falls short of fully understanding what's possible and what we can do within regenerative ag. So I'd now like to just talk about what we could potentially do on small farms. There's no doubt in my mind that depending on the size of your farm, that you can do some cropping. And I'd draw your attention to a chap by the name of Colin Seiss, who's really the leader for me in zero-till ag, chemical-free zero-till ag, and just note that that's possible, that you can grow crops on small areas. You can certainly grow pasture, and you can grow pasture and find different ways to make money out of that. You can, the pasture can be grown, and you can buy animals, or you can take agistment on or do other things with that pasture. So you can look at growing grass. You can look at alternative agriculture opportunities, and I think that, again, I mentioned All Sun Farm. Really opened my eyes that these were people who were growing eggs and vegetables on a tiny block of land and making a very good living out of it at Gundaroo. Chemicals is a big question, because a lot of adherents of regen ag say that chemicals are a no-no because of the damage that they do to the soil, because of the damage that they do to the biodiversity of what's in the soil. So if you've got biodiversity and soil health as principles, then you've really got to step away from chemicals. And that's a hard ask, and particularly I acknowledge that a lot of small farms are often not people that are full-time farmers. They're lifestyle blocks, or blocks where people have got off-farm income, principally off-farm income, and that they're looking to do what they can in limited time on that property. I would encourage you to look at ways that you can try and avoid chemical use, or use them as a one-off measure to bring something under control. So, for example, blackberries are a problem here on my farm because I've got a neighbour who's quite adept at growing them and doesn't seem to worry too much about getting rid of them for years on end, and then suddenly has a bit of a go. But in the meantime, every bird that feasts on those blackberries seems to fly over my farm and drop their seeds along fence lines, and all of a sudden you've got those looping canes growing up. But if you go out with a hoe in August or September, you can get rid of them before they get away too much. And of course, in March and April, we make blackberry jam instead from the neighbours' beautiful blackberries. So look at how you can limit the chemicals. Use them as an initial knockdown, and then revert to using other ways to control weeds. And I'll talk a little bit more about other ways in a moment. Fertilizers is another example where I think again, everything I'm reading suggests that we should be limiting the amount of fertilizer we use. We seem to be becoming more and more reliant upon putting these water-soluble nutrients out on the soil, and those water-soluble nutrients, in the case of nitrogen, 2/3 of it doesn't get to the plant, and in phosphorus, between 50 to 80% of it doesn't get to the plant, and it ends up instead in the rivers, and we end up with algal blooms in our rivers, in our creeks, and certainly in our lakes, which is absolutely devastating to our aquatic life. And so these are not things that we can turn back easily. We can't, once we've reached that tipping point, we can kill an entire lake. We've got to be far more focused on how we apply these nutrients. And instead we need to use things like cover crops and the like. We need to understand the microbes in the soil. I think for me, that was a big leap of understanding, was gathering that knowledge that allowed me to understand that the life under my feet was so important in the health of my farm. George Monbiot in his book talks about ghost acres. And so if you could imagine a chicken farm, and I know I had this discussion with the late Tony Coote out at Maloon Creek, who had an egg business out there, probably still there after his recent death. And he talked about how he had very low food miles because the eggs were laid at Bungendore and then taken into Canberra to be sold. But the reality was that the ghost acres involved there were dramatic, because up in the Darling Downs, over 1,000 kilometres away, there was an enormous amount of acres being set aside to grow the feed for the chickens that then had to be transported down here. So it sort of made a mockery of the low food miles when you look at the ghost acres and that extra distance that had to be travelled. And so these are things that we need to be aware of when we're talking about regenerative ag. Are we simply relying on inputs from other farms, from hay, from cereal to feed a pig or to feed a chook, or to feed sheep and cattle for that matter? I'd certainly like to think that you could work with your neighbours out here. The small holdings are reasonably rare, but I know some of the small people with small holdings like to work in with their larger neighbours, and I think that there's some real opportunities for tapping into that. So particularly with regard to grazing, you can offer agistment at certain times, get a large mob of cattle or sheep in, and bring a paddock down on your place, or the entire farm for that matter. But also the same thing could be done with collaboration. So that means lots of smallholders get together. It doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 or 20, could potentially go and buy a large mob of sheep, cattle. When I say large, I'm talking a couple of thousand head, and they could, over the course of 4 or 5 months, move from one farm to another, to another, to another. And just how practical that is, I'm not sure. It depends if you're on something like the King's Highway, where you're not going to walk them down the King's Highway on a Friday afternoon to your friend's property. But it is possible in some areas that those things could happen. And I think collaboration is something that possibly an entity such as this one with Alex could be utilised to facilitate people working together to try and operate at a slightly different scale. There's opportunities in backgrounding. Backgrounding is where people bring animals that aren't needed to grow rapidly, and they help them grow out to maturity, particularly known in dairy cattle. Agistment opportunities as well, and all of these things, if we're going to be grazing in a regenerative way, then we have to look at portable electric fences and movable water. We have to be able to get that herd density high, keep the grazing time low, and allow long rest periods. We talked about building biodiversity. Building biodiversity here on Moorelands was about planting lots and lots of trees and native shrubs and native grasses. And as I said, it even extended to the planting of aquatic plants in dams and creeks. So think about that. If you haven't already done dams, then that's an opportunity. If you haven't thought about linkages, then that's also an opportunity. Be willing to work together with a neighbour. So quite often, say 4 properties might meet, and you might want to put a small amount of area into building trees. But if you work with neighbours and you're able to double that or triple it or quadruple it by putting it on a boundary corner with those other neighbours, then you vastly increase the benefit to the ecosystem of that planting. So you're 2 acres or 5 acres. If you've got 4 of you, might become 20 acres instead, which is a much more significant block of planting, and really make a big difference in terms of the ecosystem. So there's lots of funding for this. There's funding through people like Landcare from time to time. There's funding through Greening Australia. There's funding through the LLS. There's funding through all sorts of people. I've recently been the benefit of some funding from Rotary, who did a project called Adopt a Tree. And so I was able to plant 2,000 trees here over September, where Rotary paid for the trees, they paid for the guards, they paid for the weed mat. And that goes a long way towards, I often think that by the time you build a fence as well, you allow about $14 to plant a tree, but that paid at least sort of $4.50 worth of that $14. So there are opportunities out there. Additionally to opportunities to get funding, there's also opportunities to get help. I had help from people like scout groups who came and helped do the planting, and flora and fauna groups out of Sydney who came to do planting. So there are opportunities. You have to tap into them. You have to go out and find them sometimes. When you're doing your plantings, I think you really need to think about things like year-round nectar. So plants that are flowering at different times of the year, because there are birds, there are bats, and there are insects that really require that nectar and that flowering opportunity. And so we should have something. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a callistemon or a kunzia or a pulteney or a devisii or whatever it might be, that's flowering at every point, every month of the year. And that will help fill the gaps for those birds. Look for gaps in the landscape that aren't being filled. So it might be for really low foliage, or it might be for things of a certain type. So it might be a tree that's gone missing. So if you can see suddenly you're driving along the side of the road and you see Indigofera, then you think, well, there's been Indigofera here at some point in time. And so you might go and make sure there's some of that on your farm. So look for the gaps of what's missing. You can also plant trees to create a seed bank, so that seed bank can be harvested, and then those seeds can be sold, or tube stock can be sold. So you could be the person who grows a certain type of wattle, maybe Acacia genestifolia or the like, and you collect the seed and then you sell the seed. Some of those seeds sell for really quite good prices, $800 a kilo or better. So think about that when you're doing your planting, and just how easy it is to go and harvest that seed later on. And also think about homes for insects, because it shouldn't be just all about birds, or it shouldn't be just about us. It should be about every part of the landscape. And so learn about your local moths, about your local butterflies and other insects, and what plants they require. I mentioned weeds there before, and I talked about hoes. I do encourage people to cut things out. There's nothing kills a weed quite as well as cutting it out with a hoe. I'm not advocating you to use chemicals, but I think that you'd be better off doing a one-off spot chemical spray and then following it up with hose in subsequent years than just resigning yourself to doing a large chemical spray every 4 or 5 years, or doing broadacre chemical sprays every year. I've seen goats used to good effect in a number of places on things like blackberry. They need to be well confined. You need some sort of electric netting fence, and I think that it's possible to get people to bring their goats in to graze on your place. And I'm not sure quite how that works, but I've certainly witnessed it on a bad patch of blackberry up at Blakeney Creek, not far from where I am. So look for alternative ways to control weeds other than reaching for the backpack. Carbon in soil is something that's that I could talk about for a long time, but I'd just like you to be aware that growing grass. So if you walk out anywhere right now, you can see. Look at your lawn. If you own a lawn, that stuff's growing like billio right now. It's absolutely going gangbusters. And these are the very basics of photosynthesis. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide. Using the beauty of photosynthesis breaks that carbon from the oxygen's breathed back out, and the carbon's retained by the plant. But the plant at this time of the year may be pushing up to almost 50% of that carbon back outside the plant in the root zone. And so that's where we're getting our carbon in our soil, because the plant is feeding, it's literally feeding bacteria and soil fungi that carbon that it's produced. So once we're aware of that, we start to be, I think, much more conscious of how we graze. We don't overgraze, so we don't end up with really, really, really short bowling green type short grass. We only ever graze so it's about 5 centimeters long, and so it's always in that high growth phase, because in that high growth phase, it's pumping more carbon out into the soil. I think we need to look a lot more at cover crops. It's something in Australia that we don't do as well as the people in North America and in Europe, and even across over in New Zealand. Cover crops are diverse by their nature. They go to great depths in the soil. They help build structure, and they help to make nutrients available in that top layer for plants that we want to follow up with, such as a pasture or a food crop. Get away from monocultures. Don't be fixated on a lucerne or an oat crop. Try and, wherever possible, have diversification. And also think about, if you've got animals that they don't just graze grass, but they browse leaves. So start planting shrubs, plant acacias for that browsing. They'll browse not just the leaves, but also the seeds. I think repair is also something that's really important. A lot of blocks have got bad erosion. It's been inherited. It certainly was the case here on my farm. The erosion was here before I came, but it still has to be fixed. Sometimes that can be fixed without getting a big yellow machine that chews up diesel at vast rates. It can be done in ways that are much more one person or two people working together, building things out of stuff that's lying around on the farm can help fix some of these erosion issues. Understanding salinity, understanding where it's a problem. Look at things like lack of nests. You could see I'm planting trees for superb parrots that probably won't benefit any superb parrot until about 2150. So I won't see it happen, but nesting boxes can be provided for things like pardalotes and some of those small animals. Understand the benefits of riparian and rocky outcrops. And I draw your attention to an initiative by ANU called Sustainable Farms. And they've got a great book that they released last year. I think it was last year. It's well worth looking at, because it'll help guide you with what you can do or what you should do to protect the species and the things that grow on both riparian and rocky outcrops. if you're not tapped into the local Indigenous community, do so where you can. Go to events where there's talk about Indigenous burning. Go to events where you can find out more about how people lived in this landscape for tens of thousands of years. Go with an open mind, listen, and appreciate just how little knowledge we have compared to the accumulated knowledge of those 1,000 generations in the people that came before us. I also think that you can own land without necessarily being a farmer. So you can lease your country out to people if you've already got an income somewhere else, but you can set the parameters under which that land would be managed. So, but it does, I do see a lot of small farms that aren't particularly productive. I see some that are incredibly productive. So that's not a generalization, but I'm just saying that we have a focus and don't have your lack of time be the thing that shapes what you can or you can't do. For those interested in market gardening or growing vegetables, those two guys, they're Jody Roebuck's in New Zealand. The other chap's in France or Canada, French speaking anyhow, Jean Martin. And if you look them up, they've got some wonderful resources, books and workshops about doing things that would earn a sizable six-figure income off a tiny amount of land. I'm talking 4 or 5 acres. So I think that there's a lot to be said for permaculture. I think that it was a movement of its time, and it was a lot based around design. But as I look at my vegetable garden, and I wish there'd been more permaculture thought put to it when it was first established, because there's stuff in the wrong places. And I know that with the right work on most small farms, that you could grow enough produce to service a number of homes. Agroforestry is another area. We do still need timber, and there's things that we can do within small farms in that area, but that has to still adhere to these other issues for regenerative agriculture. I do like what Alex has been doing with this group, because I do think that you have to come together with people that are like-minded, people who have the same type of challenges. I think often problems that are shared are problems that are halved, because you see solutions and you see things that people have done that didn't succeed. So you're able to learn from others' experience. And I think that ability to socialize and to look at what other people have done is really important, and to support each other. So it's not just about seeking support, but it's also about giving support. So I'd certainly encourage you all to continue your membership of this group, which I think is brilliant. Georges Monbiot, who wrote Regenerative, was talking about the cost of buying new kit or doing any work on a farm in terms of the carbon cost, that it would send most properties back into the red in terms of their carbon offprint. And I do think that we have to be careful that we don't become too much living the mall lifestyle, as I put it, too focused on consumerism, that we try and make things work. We try and fix what we've got. We try and sell it rather than plant it down in the paddock or in a shed where we don't find it for another 100 years. Borrow stuff off somebody else. Currently borrowing a log splitter off a neighbour. They're a couple of $1,000 to buy, and I could conceivably justify buying my own one, but why do it? Why not just borrow one, and rather than have two out there? So we talked about benchmarking, and I think first and foremost, I would encourage you to do benchmarking via photos. Take photos of the soil. Take photos from set points on your farm, where you look out and where you also tilt the camera down and you look down at the soil. And then repeat this every time you do your BAS, or every time you do you put your tax return in, or whenever it happens to be. So if you're doing it at BAS, you're doing it 4 times a year, I think. So, but I think that you'll find that photos will be a great help to start with. There's other things that you can do. You can do bird surveys yourself. You can do bat surveys in some cases, or you can get some of the tertiary institutions to help with that. You can measure organic matter in soil, get those soil carbon levels, and understand what measures that you're doing are impacting that soil carbon. You can see what diversity of microbes you have. How many species of fungi do you have? If you have 4,000 one year and you have 5,000 another year, then you're doing something right. If your protozoa levels are up, if your bacteria numbers are dramatically up, but more importantly, the diversity of different types of bacteria have increased. And so there's an organisation called Soil Food Web based up at near Lismore there at next to the University of Southern Cross University that can help with that. Be focused on things like your cation exchange capacity. Once upon a time, that was a bit like stocking rate. It was something that I thought was locked in. But if you're increasing your carbon, you can increase your cation exchange capacity. This has specific reference to calcium, potassium, magnesium, the ability of those to be up for uptake in the soil, but you can improve your cation exchange capacity through more carbon being added to your soil. And finally, get your head around soil tests, because soil tests are often tests done by fertilizer companies to sell fertilizers. So they take a soil sample, they'll pour on an acid of a certain strength, and that acid will wash through a certain amount of phosphorus or potassium or whatever else. And they're trying to replicate what's happening in a living soil, where enzymes released by bacteria, by fungi, will make nutrients that aren't available, turn them into a plant available form. And so they're simply trying to mimic that. They're not doing it accurately, and the amount of labile P in the soil is not necessarily an indicator of whether your plants have got a phosphorus deficiency or not. So understand those soil tests, understand that your soil probably has enough nutrients if you have the right soil microorganism suite of microorganisms there to release it for your plants. I think that we all have to start thinking globally and look at where we can electrify wherever we can. I'd love to be able to buy a quad bike that's electric. They just don't seem to exist. But if you get a choice between buying an engine that's an electric one or a diesel one, always try and think globally and buy the electric one. For people who are in and around Canberra, you are blessed with some wonderful examples of our local ecosystem as it was without the disturbance of agriculture. So you go to places like Garooyaroo or Mulligan's Flat, and you can see how things should have been. and excuse me. And I think it's really important to be across how things should have been, because it helps you then plan what you can do on your own farm. Get involved with Sustainable Farms, ANU, as I mentioned, and Greening Australia. And finally, I'd just encourage you to buy fibre or food from people who are regenerative ag people, because that helps encourage them in doing what they're doing. So Alex, thank you for that. I'll just pause. I can see that there's a few things in chats there. How would you like to handle this from going on?
That's great. Thanks, Vince. Oh, you've turned your screen share off. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Cooking. Yeah, got it all going on. It's great. Thanks so much. That was a really interesting presentation. So would you like me to read you the questions that people have put forward there, Vince?
Sure. Let's roll like that.
Okay, no worries. So we've got a question here from Rob. He's keen to know how you chose Texels.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah.
I inherited a few Texels when I first arrived on the farm in 2002. There was a couple here. The thing that I noticed about them was that they tasted good. They were really good to eat. And there was a butcher down in Cootamundra, still is, Cootamundra Butchery, who was selling only Texels through their shop. And they had an incredible reputation. People were traveling from a long distance to buy that meat. And the meat's very, in terms of texture. So the MLA describes merino meat as coarse and ropey, but Texel meat by comparison is really silky and fine in its texture. And it's got a lovely, sweet, sort of nutty fat. I've had this, my lamb gets taken to a number of restaurants that are 2 and 3 hat restaurants, and people comment about it, and it gets favourable restaurant reviews. And all the time people talk about the sweetness of the fat, or that cashew or nutty sort of flavour profile in the fat. So the Texels eat well, but I'd also note that they've got a different temperament to other sheep. I particularly dislike merinos because of their temperament. They're just sheep that are born with a already fully signed death certificate. They seem to want to find ways to die, and they just don't like living. There's something about them. But Texels are sheep that have got a bit of character, and they're wonderful mothers. They'd never leave their lambs, and I should never say never, but they're great animals in that sense. They've got a bit of character, and I love their temperament as well. So that's really how I arrived at them. And I'm certainly looking at, there's work being done by a guy down at Holbrook called Tom Bull. So if you look up Lamb Pro or Google Lamb Pro, you'll see his work, and he's using he's really ignoring breeds, and he's just trying to find sheep that are very productive, very easy care. So they produce lots of lambs. They produce them early. The lambs grow quite quickly. They're not huge sheep, so they don't take up extra space. It's easy to get a big lamb if you've got a big ewe that eats a lot more than a small ewe. But he's some of the things he's doing are really interesting, and I'm interested to see how I could incorporate those things into my Texel operation. I'm not sure how I can, but So thank you for the question. The Texels are from the Netherlands originally. There's an island off the coast of the Netherlands called Texel, and very common breed in the UK and in Ireland and in Scotland and in northern France. Quite uncommon here in Australia, and I'm not quite sure why that is.
Thanks for that. So Steve has asked, what method do you use to calculate carrying capacity?
So carrying capacity, most farms, large farms, you would have been told when you bought the farm or inherited the farm that the carrying capacity here is, let's say, 8,000 DSC, 10,000 DSC. And I think that's probably about what my farm would be rated at, something in that sort of area. So you've got this historical benchmark, but the historical benchmark doesn't take into account things that influence your carrying capacity, such as precipitation. So holistic grazing, if you go and do a holistic grazing course, they've got quite a complex way of working out the number of head you can carry using a rolling rainfall calculator for your carrying capacity. So that will be influenced entirely by things like rain. But rain is often also, it's usable rain. If we get 5 inches in an hour, then a lot of that by its nature has got to go across the top of the soil. It's not going down into the soil. We can't absorb that much, those really heavy falls. So it's about usable rainfall. And but it's a really important fact to get your head around, because once you understand what your carrying capacity is, you can see as you go into a dry spell that your carrying capacity will diminish over time. So you can graph it and you can see it start to go down, and so then you need to adjust your stocking rate again to match your stocking rate to your carrying capacity.
Okay.
Locally, our Landcare group locally, this is in the Upper Lachlan. So Upper Lachlan's an area that goes from sort of Crookhall, Gunning, out almost to Burra, almost to Goulburn, or out to Taralga, have a grazing group. And there's about 120 people in that grazing group, sort of maybe 80 at any given meeting, and lots of small landholders there. And they talk about carrying capacity a lot. Paul Hewitt runs that group, and if you want those details, I'm happy to share them with anybody who's interested.
Okay. Oh, good. Thanks, Vince. With rotational grazing, with the long rest periods, does the grass end up long and rank, and how do you manage for feed quality for your sheep?
Yeah, look, I think that's important, and sometimes it does. You know, we've certainly seen. I haven't been able to get my stocking rate up high enough this last summer that passed, and so as a result, some of that dry grass carried through into winter, and it's seen a diminishment in the quality of the feed on offer for my sheep. And I've had a little bit of trouble finishing lambs as a result. It's been slower than usual. But yeah, so if it shouldn't be something that you write down on a piece of paper today that I'm going to rest the paddock for 120 days or 150 days. Should be something that's a little bit more dynamic than that. So, but to bring the feed levels down, you have to have enough animals with the mouths on it to get rid of the grass at the appropriate time. But you know, if you'd taken a mob out of a paddock today, say what are we, early October, and you lock the paddock up for October, November, December, January, sort of February, then it's a long way away, and you do risk that you know that feed quality can in a high growth period like this, you'd probably want to be revisiting that paddock before now.
Okay.
You wouldn't want to be on 5 months right now, I don't think, given the amount of growth that we're experiencing.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few comments there just about 4-wheel drive golf buggies, and also just a comment about soil tests and checking out Jason Condon's excellent talk explaining soil tests on the soil network.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I think that we may have covered everything there in terms of questions, Vince. So I think we're pretty close to have covered everything, and that was a very comprehensive and informative presentation. So I thank you very much for that.
That's all right. I can see one asking about hoeing weeds there.
Sorry, if I missed one.
Well, certainly with things like
yes.
serrated tussock, you have to get the weed, you have to get the roots out, and with Bathurst burrs. But for other things like Scotch thistles or variegated thistles, you can cut through the root and you're able to stop it. I'd offer free tuition lessons for anyone who wants to come out and do 2 or 3 days of hoeing weeds to make sure that they just fine tune those things. But anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good. I reckon the person who did that would probably learn so much in return. So
probably
that sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to wrap things up. Vince, I'll share my screen again just for a moment,
okay,
and
sure.
we'll come back and